Hi everybody, and welcome to the weekly Waterjet webinar series. This is now week 7. So getting through now, only this one more to go. So this week we're going to be concentrating on the consumable items you use with your Waterjet, what consumables you generally use, and how frequently you're going to use them. And we're also going to touch on Garnet as well, the different types and different ways in which you can use that. So let's get stuck into it. Like I said, we're going to go through the most common types of abrasives, Waterjet consumables you're going to use, how frequently you're going to use them, and Garnet. So most common types you're going to use on your Waterjet system are going to be mixing tubes. That is these pieces here. These are your mixing tubes. This is where the majority of the work is done with an abrasive Waterjet system. It has the water and abrasive passing through it, and as the name suggests, it's a mixing tube. Therefore, that's where the water and abrasive get mixed together, and it gets concentrated down into that fine jet, which goes through the material and determines your cutting. Another thing is the nozzle guards. That's this yellow cup section here. That there prevents any kind of splashing happening, especially on the pierce. While you're piercing, if the water's not going all the way through the material, then it generally gets thrown up. So what we do is we put these yellow cups around the nozzle tip, and that stops that from happening, keeps everything nicely contained within the unit. But as you can imagine, the more piercing you do, the more that's going to get worn, and the quicker you're going to have to replace it. The next thing is filters. Now, on a Waterjet system, there are various filters. You have filters on your pump, you have filters on your incoming water supply, you have filters within the wet end of the pump, and you also have a filter just above the orifice assembly on your nozzle as well. So all of these filters will require replacement at some stage or another. Next thing, which is not very commonly spoken about, is the abrasive feed tubing. Just a small little sample of it here. This will be the tubing that takes the abrasive from the hopper on the head into the nozzle itself. Now, as you can imagine, with anything that has abrasive running through it, it's going to get worn away pretty quickly. And it gets worn away quite significantly the more turns you have within that abrasive feed tube. So it's always a good idea to have some of this on hand to replace out the tube as it wears, because that will affect your cutting. It can sometimes even go as far as to stop your cutting as well. So that's quite a common piece to need replacing. Another thing is the seals and the seats within an on-off valve. So an on-off valve is basically the valve that starts and stops the water going to and from the nozzle. So as you can imagine, with every pierce, the needle is going into the seat and coming back out again. So that's going to wear out eventually as well. So that's probably one of your higher consumable items, depending again on how much piercing you're doing. On every Waterjet system, there are swivels, because without swivels, you'll be putting a lot of torsional force through your tubing work, which will cause them to fail quickly. So you need swivels in there to make sure that everything moves quickly and lasts as long as possible. But with any mechanical component like that, anything that's moving, there are going to be parts that require replacement. And inside the swivel assemblies are little seals and bits and pieces which you'll need to change every so often. And then, of course, the big one is the pump rebuild kits. All the seals and seats, everything that's involved inside those. You'll need to be replacing those as well. One thing not on this list is the UHP tubing itself, the stainless steel UHP tubing. That again will require replacement. Anything that contains pressure, is a pressure vessel, does wear, and will require replacement at some stage. Okay, now let's move on to the frequency rate with which you are going to need to replace these components. So the first one, let's look at the mixing tubes. This is probably going to be your highest cost item in terms of monthly or yearly spend. You will get between 60 to 100 hours out of your mixing tube, depending on how well you look after it. There are certain maintenance things you can do on a weekly basis which help you look after your mixing tube and help you get the best life possible. Also, other factors such as the amount of abrasive you put through your mixing tube, how many pierces you do, direction of the piercing, all those kind of things will all contribute to how quickly a mixing tube will last. The age of your nozzle body as well that you're putting the mixing tube into. If it's an old nozzle body with quite a wide jet stream on it with a worn orifice, that's going to wear your mixing tube out quicker. So there's a number of factors which go into determining mixing tube life, but you can normally bank on seeing between 60 to 100 hours of life out of a mixing tube. The abrasive feed tubing itself, that plastic tubing we spoke about before, I would suggest you probably change just a small section of that, the bit that goes from the larger feed tubing into the nozzle body itself, probably once a week. So let's say every 40 hours. That way you can make sure that it keeps going and doesn't wear out on you mid-cut, because that's the last thing you want to happen. The on-off valve assembly itself, so the rebuild kit, the seats, the needle and everything inside that, we normally say that's good for around 30,000 pierces. We do see customers get well in excess of that. We see some people getting towards 90 and 100,000 cycles before they require replacement. But if you want to run a preventative schedule, then around about 30,000 is a good place to start to look to rebuild your on-off valve. It's a quick process to do. The kit's pretty inexpensive, and it just involves literally taking out a backup ring, a seal, a needle, and a seat, and just replacing them. The swivels. The swivel seals, again, on a preventative cycle, you want to be changing those once a year. That way it makes sure that they will continue to run flawlessly for that year and won't fail on you. Halfway through a cut, again, it'll require you to take those apart and rebuild them halfway through cutting something. So we always recommend a preventative schedule, because that way then you can plan your maintenance, you minimize your downtime, you can make sure you've got the parts to hand ready to do that maintenance. So it's always a good idea to do a preventative schedule rather than a reactive schedule. Crankcase oil. So all OMAX systems come with a direct drive pump, which obviously has a crankcase on it. And as with all crankcases in the world, this contains oil. So you need to replace that oil every 300 to 500 hours. Again, this can be once a year, this could be twice a year, all depends on how much you use the machine. Next is your filters and your nozzle guards that we mentioned before. So your filters and the nozzle guards, they're just as and when required, because so many variable factors go into the life of your filters and your nozzle guards that we can't predict how long they're going to last. So the filters will obviously depend on your water quality, depend on the flow rate of your water as well, temperature of water, all these kind of things will determine your filter life. Nozzle guards, like I said, number of pierces, high-speed cutting, thickness of material that you're doing, so length of piercing, all that kind of stuff will determine the life of your nozzle guard. Your pump wet end, depending on the system you have, whether it's the Global Max, the Maxim, or the Enduramax systems, you'll get between 500 to 800 hours out of a pump rebuild. So you can be doing that once every couple of years, you can be doing that twice a year. It really does depend on how many hours you're putting into your machine. One item not on this list is obviously your nozzle body. Now, the MaxJet 5i nozzle bodies from OMAX will last you more than 500 hours. They are guaranteed to 500. We regularly get reports of customers getting far in excess of 1,000 hours out of each one. Normally, you'd say between 750 and 1,000 is your standard life. But like I said, we do get people who get well in excess of 1,000 hours out of them as well. So as you can see, there's a number of consumable items within a Waterjet system. The rates in which you're going to use them are pretty high. So as in, like, long-lasting parts, they're going to obviously last you a while and keep you cutting. One thing I will say when looking at spare parts or consumable items for your abrasive Waterjet is be wary of third-party spares. So spares that are not actually manufactured by OMAX themselves, the spares that have been manufactured by a third party. They are not manufactured using the same materials, the same tolerances that OMAX do. They don't have OMAX's drawings, they don't have OMAX's designs, they are literally copying them. So we cannot guarantee the quality of those components. All right, so make sure when you're doing your calculations in terms of life of components, if you want to factor in the maximum life, then you need to be using genuine OMAX components. Otherwise, you don't know how long these things are going to last. Okay, lastly, let's move on to abrasive, Garnet. So the abrasive that abrasive Waterjet systems use is Garnet. There are a couple of different types of Garnet abrasive. One's called hard rock, the other's called alluvial. Hard rock is literally crushed rock that's taken from mines. Alluvial is garnet's been dredged from riverbeds of all places. There's a few countries that manufacture this in the world. We have South Africa, we have India, even here in Australia. Over in WA, they manufacture garnet abrasive. There's generally for Waterjet cutting 2 common sizes. 80 mesh is the most common. It's where the majority of the manufacturers do all their cutting. We can supply with 120 mesh as well. Now, what the 120 mesh is good for is if you're using like a really, really small nozzle, like the OMAX Mini Jet, for example, that cuts down to less than half a million diameter jet width, then that way you have to use the 120 mesh because the 80 mesh wouldn't actually fit through the nozzle. If you're doing glass work, if you're doing a lot of plastic work, we recommend using the 120 mesh as well, because it gives you a much finer finish on the surface, which is really, really good for that glass work and mirrors and plastics. It does cut a little bit slower, the 120 mesh. The flow rate between 120 and the 80 is pretty similar, but because of the fine nature of the 120, means you will be cutting slightly slower, and it is slightly more expensive to purchase in the initial setup as well. So just bear that in mind. If you need it, great. If you don't, stick with 80 mesh. It'll do everything you want to do. Consumable rate of your abrasive. Now this varies greatly depending on your setup, and depending on what it is you want to achieve. With our systems, you'll generally be running somewhere between 200 grams a minute all the way up to 1.2 kilos a minute, depending on your setup and your requirement. Obviously, the more abrasive you use, the faster you can cut. It's a simple formula, because remember, with all this, as I've said from day one, it's the abrasive that's doing the work, not the water. The water merely carries the abrasive through the material. It's the abrasive that's actually eroding the material away and giving you that cut edge. So the more abrasive you put in there, then the faster you're going to cut. But obviously, you need the volume of water coming through the nozzle to be able to carry that amount of abrasive. So therefore, the most important thing when looking at how fast a Waterjet will cut is hydraulic horsepower at the nozzle, like I've always said. All right, so that pretty much concludes it for today. We'll keep it nice and short and sweet. And if you have any questions, please please feel free to email me at mattheww@headland.com.au, or you can give me a call on 0427 462 678, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully speak to you soon. Thank you.